Hi, welcome to A Gray Barn Rising. I'm really happy you could join us this evening. I'm sitting here with the best hound dog in the world. Many of you already know Bootsy Beagle. And I'm drinking a cup of oolong tea this evening. It's Iron Goddess of Mercy tea, named after the Iron Goddess, Kuan Yin. It's a delightful Chinese tea. I'm reading the poetry this evening of a wonderful American poet, Elizabeth Bishop. Elizabeth Bishop lived from 1911 to 1979, and she was actually Poet Laureate of the United States from 1949 to 1950. She is an incredible poet of psychological depth, and that psychological depth for Elizabeth Bishop really manifests itself in large part in her view and perception and ability to exert deep attentiveness into and through the outer world. Her ability to see is almost unparalleled in American poetry. Certainly her ability to chronicle what she's seeing. And her outward gaze is deep and full of deep attention that really then accretes and becomes emotional and psychological. I just love her ability to do that. She did not have an easy early life. Her father died when she was 8 months old, and her mother had psychological and emotional problems in the ensuing years, and Elizabeth Bishop moved in with different relatives from the time she was 4 or 5 years old, and she even moved from relative to relative for a period in her early years. I think that early mobility also has given her a kind of grounding, or at least a desire to ground her vision into something stable and permanent in the world. So I'd like to share with you some of her poems. The first poem I'd like to read is one of her more famous poems, and one of her poems that I simply adore, and it's entitled The Fish. And I think you'll see in this poem, in hearing it, her incredible ability to see the world. Well, to quote the poet William Stafford in another context, he has a title of a poem called In Dear Detail by Ideal Light. And I think in many ways this poem, her seeing, chronicles the world in dear detail by ideal light. The Fish. I caught a tremendous fish and held him beside the boat, half out of water, with my hook fast in a corner of his mouth. He didn't fight. He hadn't fought at all. He hung a grunting weight, battered and venerable and homely. Here and there, his brown skin hung in strips like ancient wallpaper, and its pattern of darker brown was like wallpaper, shapes like full-blown roses, stained and lost through age. He was speckled with barnacles, fine rosettes of lime, and infested with tiny white sea lice, and underneath 2 or 3 rags of green weed hung down. While his gills were breathing in the terrible oxygen, the frightening gills, fresh and crisp with blood that can cut so badly, I thought of the coarse white flesh packed in like feathers, the big bones and the little bones, the dramatic reds and blacks of his shiny entrails, and the pink swim bladder like a big peony. I looked into his eyes, which were far larger than mine, but shallower and yellowed, the irises backed and packed with tarnished tinfoil, seen through the lenses of old scratched isinglass. They shifted a little, but not to return my stare. It was more like the tipping of an object toward the light. I admired his sullen face, the mechanism of his jaw, and then I saw that from his lower lip, if you could call it a lip, grim, wet, and weapon-like, hung 5 old pieces of fish line, or 4 and a wire leader with the swivel still attached, with all their 5 big hooks grown firmly in his mouth. A green line, frayed at the end where he broke it, 2 heavier lines, and a fine black thread still crimped from the strain and snap when it broke and he got away. Like metals with their ribbons frayed and wavering, a 5-haired beard of wisdom trailing from his aching jaw. I stared, and victory filled up the little rented boat from the pool of bilge where oil had spread a rainbow around the rusted engine to the bailer rusted orange. The sun cracked thwarts, the oarlocks on their strings, the gunnels, until everything was rainbow, rainbow, rainbow. And I let the fish go. Mind-blowing to me how she's able to see the world that deeply. It's just an incredible poem of seeing. Elizabeth Bishop is not a poet who normally reveals many intimate details about her life. Unlike her close friend and correspondent Robert Lowell, who certainly revealed a lot of details about his life, Elizabeth Bishop really doesn't do that, and I think the holding in, the restraint of not doing that also has enabled her to have this incredible compression in which what she then does is she turns that, what would normally be a revelation of her life and inner details, she turns that into the outer world to this incredible moment of seeing. And because of that restraint and compression, I think what begins to happen is that the emotion and the emotional weight that one would normally give to revelation of detail is then filtered through and channeled into the outer environment, so that we get that outer scene, but we also get this deep well of emotion in her as well. It just comes from a different source. Here's another poem of hers, Electrical Storm. Dawn in unsympathetic yellow, crack, dry and light. The house was really struck. Crack, a tinny sound, like a dropped tumbler. Tobias jumped in the window, got in bed, silent, his eyes bleached white, his fur on end, personal and spiteful as a neighbor's child. Thunder began to bang and bump the roof. One pink flash, then hail, the biggest size of artificial pearls, dead white, wax white, cold. Diplomats' wives' favors from an old moon party. They lay in melting windrows on the red ground until well after sunrise. We got up to find the wiring fused, no lights, a smell of saltpeter, and the telephone dead. The cat stayed in the warm sheets. The Lent trees had shed all their petals, wet, stuck, purple among the dead-eye pearls. And finally, I want to share with you another one of my favorite Elizabeth Bishop poems. It's up there for me with the fish. It's called In the Waiting Room. I mentioned her not revealing many intimate details about her life, and this is a poem in which actually she does say more about her personal life. This is a great poem of coming of age, and I'm so moved by it because it's the child seeing her place in the adult world and experiencing both awe and fear in that realization. It also parallels the First World War, which in many ways was the world's coming of age into a new way of seeing the international community and one's place in the international community. I just love the threads of the public and private in this poem. It's called In the Waiting Room. In Worcester, Massachusetts, I went with Aunt Consuelo to keep her dentist's appointment and sat and waited for her in the dentist's waiting room. It was winter. It got dark early. The waiting room was full of grown-up people, Arctics and overcoats, lamps and magazines. My aunt was inside what seemed like a long time, and while I waited, I read the National Geographic. I could read and carefully studied the photographs. The inside of a volcano, black and full of ashes. Then it was spilling over in rivulets of fire. Osa and Martin Johnson, dressed in riding breeches, laced boots and pith helmets. A dead man slung on a pole, long pig, the caption read. Babies with pointed heads wound round and round with string. Black, naked women with necks wound round and round with wire, like the necks of light bulbs. Their breasts were horrifying. I read it right straight through. I was too shy to stop. And then I looked at the cover, the yellow margins, the date. Suddenly, from inside came an awe of pain. Aunt Consuelo's voice, not very loud or long. I wasn't at all surprised. Even then I knew she was a foolish, timid woman. I might have been embarrassed, but wasn't. What took me completely by surprise was that it was me, my voice, in my mouth. Without thinking at all, I was my foolish aunt. We were falling, our eyes glued to the cover of the National Geographic, February 1918. I said to myself, 3 days and you'll be 7 years old. I was saying it to stop the sensation of falling off the round, turning world into cold, blue-black space. But I felt, you are an I. You are an Elizabeth. You are one of them. Why should you be one too? I scarcely dared to look to see what it was I was. I gave a sidelong glance. I couldn't look any higher at shadowy gray knees, trousers and skirts and boots and different pairs of hands lying under the lamps. I knew that nothing stranger had ever happened, that nothing stranger could ever happen. Why should I be my aunt, or me, or anyone? What similarities, boots, hands, the family voice I felt in my throat, or even the National Geographic and those awful hanging breasts held us all together, or made us all just one. How? I didn't know any word for it. How unlikely. How had I come to be here like them and overhear a cry of pain that could have got loud and worse but hadn't? The waiting room was bright and too hot. It was sliding beneath a big black wave. Another and another. Then I was back in it. The war was on. Outside in Worcester, Massachusetts, were night and slush and cold. And it was still the 5th of February, 1918. Boy, that poem brings together, as I mentioned before I read it, the public and the private, and I want to add the individual and personal with the universal in such powerful ways. It just always blows me away. Those are a few poems of the American poet Elizabeth Bishop. I read this evening from her complete poems, 1927 to 1979. I would imagine this book is readily available, and I would encourage you to seek it out. I just gave you a small taste of her work, and I hope that you enjoyed hearing her poems this evening, and that you indeed will seek out and read more of her work. Thank you so much for joining us for A Great Barn Rising.